This is the moment when Beth Harmon realizes she's beaten Borgov in the Queen's Gambit. She uses a pawn, a lowly pawn, derided by some, overlooked by many. But what if I told you that pawns matter both to the game of chess and to the show much more than you might think? Some say they're the game's very soul. We'll explain. Beth Harmon is an underdog, by gender, by upbringing, by temperament, even by nationality. All are viewed as obstacles to her winning at some point. And if there were any chess piece that has a similar underdog swagger, it's gotta be the pawn. See, there's a sort of accepted class hierarchy in chess. You read a lot about how the king is the most important chess piece because the game hinges upon his capture, while the queen is the most powerful because of her striking range. An individual pawn, on the other hand, is typically valued at 1 point, the lowest you can get. And in play, pawns can indeed be dead men walking, especially those close to the center. This chart by programmer Oliver Brennan shows the survival rates of chess pieces, and yeah, queen's pawns are basically goners. I mean, look how easily Beth gives up both D and C file pawns here. By the way, this is a very rare subline of the Scandinavian defense called the Blackburn Kloosterboer Gambit, where black aggressively challenges for control, and isn't it interesting that they later appear in their sides' respective colors? As if they're jockeying for control? Anyway, but some, including the 18th century French chess master and composer François-André Philidor, have seen something more than cannon fodder in a pawn. He's the one that said the pawn was the soul of chess. And he should know. In addition to the defense that's named after him, he was the first to write extensively about chess strategy. He's not the only one to have made the pro-pawn argument, though. Teachers still recommend pawn-only games to learn fundamentals, and if you think the show isn't aware of this, watch episode 2 when Beth picks up Chess Review. What's the giant ad? Pawn power in chess. So perhaps it's no coincidence then that Beth beats both her first adversary with a threatened pawn promotion and her final adversary with an actual one. Because this ability is a pawn's superpower, one that can't be ignored. When one pawn makes it to the farthest rank from their starting position, they then level up, usually into a queen, but not always. Passed pawns, fast-breaking pawns heading for promotion with only open squares ahead and on adjacent files are considered so dangerous that one chess master argued that they should be jailed. Now, according to this graph by Robert Kaspar, it seems that promotions don't happen in high-level chess as often as the Queen's Gambit suggests. It's thematic. But many say that's because high-level players usually resign at the first whiff of one. You can connect every rule governing pawns back to this pawn promotion. On one hand, and unlike any other piece, they travel double their normal amount on their first move and they can't move backwards. The game entices you to move forward. And on the other hand, but also unlike any other piece, they move differently than they attack, meaning you can actually block a pawn's advance by just sticking something in front of them. There's the counterbalance. Pawn promotion isn't just powerful in gameplay though, it's chess's classic metaphor. The little pawn wades through hell to rise up to royalty status, and if you don't think it influenced the Queen's Gambit, look how Beth wears a pawn-like white collar the first time we see her younger self, and then a queen-like hat, little ball and all, in her final scene. But maybe the more subtle way a pawn influences the game of chess is through pawn structures, the shifting formations that pawns make as a group. According to some pawn lovers, these sometimes beautiful configurations define the space and therefore dictate the game.
What are you reading about?
Pawn structure analysis.
Sounds exciting.
It is.
Most obviously, a good pawn structure lets you move the more powerful pieces out of the back row, but it also influences the movement of the other side. They may be tempted to occupy so-called weak squares in your territory, the ones which no pawns are guarding. Conversely then, your pawn structures can help you control the center, important because that's where the kings live. From reinforceable pawn chains to vulnerable pawn islands, Different pawn structures have their strengths and weaknesses, but you can tell that the creators of the Queen's Gambit geek out on them. Not only are there lines about pawn structure like this,
They left backward pawns all over the place.
but there's also a whole episode named Doubled Pawns, referring to Beth's attempt to lure Benny into a dubious pawn structure where 2 pawns squat in a single file, slowing movement with no protection for either. Oh, Benny. Still, there are skeptics, and maybe you too need something more concrete to prove that pawns matter. Well, on a larger level, Google ran some tests using their chess AI and found that simply giving pawns 2 moves each turn instead of 1 doubled the number of games won by white and black. It created a different, volatile game. Then there's the endgame. Usually a few pawns make it to the end. In fact, pawn and rook endings are the most common in chess, and this is where the pawn shines. This formula calculates the winning percentage in a game based on pawn advantage, and just having 1 pawn advantage gives a player a 64% chance of winning, and that can go up to a 90% chance in some endgame scenarios. So if someone says that pawns don't matter,
It's all pawns, no hope.
remind them that you have to see them all together, or you have to wait until the end to see their true potential. Power to the pawn. Okay, but the pawn does have one last superpower, and this one is a little spooky. It's an attack called en passant, and if you're like me and have never played chess, you've never heard of it. But basically, it allows a pawn to capture another pawn that moved 2 spaces, but that could have been dead if it had only moved 1. So pawns can even capture pieces on completely different squares. Pawn power.